Perhaps the most talked about international incident in the last few weeks has been French President Emmanuel Macron's series of controversial statements in China. Today, I'll discuss what it means for France's position on the Indo-Pacific, on transatlantic ties, on European support for Ukraine, and finally, what can it mean for India? Hi, trust you're all doing well. The Macron-Von der Leyen visit to China has sparked a blitzkrieg of a debate over an allegedly unity-disunity paradox in Europe. The visit was essentially Europe playing good cop, bad cop in Beijing, with French President the good cop in terms of underscoring economic importance of China to Europe, while the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, playing the bad one, having announced economic de-risking from China recently. The good cop, bad cop strategy didn't really fall in place and instead perpetuated a baffling cacophony of Europe's views, lacking in coordination and feeding the egos and sarcasm of Eurosceptics, especially the Chinese. You know what happened? That Macron gave Chinese what they wanted to hear. The Chinese media stated it as Xi's victory over Europe, embracing a brilliant Macron while alienating the American puppet von der Leyen. Beijing rolled out the red carpet for Macron, congratulating him for finally breaking free from US's warmongering worldview, most notably on Taiwan. On the contrary, China's skeptic von der Leyen's reception was poles apart. She was greeted by the ecology minister at the regular passenger exit of the airport. Soon after Macron's ill-pitched and ill-timed gaffe on US dependence and Taiwan, clarifications started flowing over how Macron's statements do not mean any shift from French policies either in the Indo-Pacific or on Taiwan, and that France stays committed to transatlantic ties. The world watched as American and European diplomats got busy with damage control. Thereafter, Germany's foreign minister Annalena Baerbock took the responsibility of putting out this fire on her trip to China. After the visit, she called it shocking and said that China is indeed becoming a systemic rival. Next, EU's High Representative Joseph Borrell also announced a trip to China for the same, but that didn't materialize because he got a COVID infection. The week after his Beijing visit, Macron, suave and undeterred, repeated the same strategic autonomy song, this time in the Netherlands. So what really are Macron's objectives? There are two questions to answer. The first, why is France's quest for strategic autonomy looked upon as a discordant note in European symphony today? And secondly, and more importantly, why did Macron travel to China at all? Let's decode the China trip first. So, Macron travelled to China for primarily two reasons. First, the trade benefits. It was expected that the visit would reset Europe's economic ties with China. More than 50 French entrepreneurs and senior executives, including nuclear energy giant EDF, the Alstom Railway, and Airbus, accompanied Macron. Furthermore, Macron did not want to lag behind his main European competitor, Germany, whose Chancellor Olaf Scholz made a rather successful trip to China in November last year. And second, for Ukraine. Geopolitically, the Ukraine war and its ramifications figured as the top priority. French President tried to persuade Xi Jinping to put some pressure on Russia. Now, lest public memory falls short, Macron made frequent trips to Moscow before the war started, confident that his stewardship of diplomatic engagement with Putin will perhaps convince him to not invade Ukraine. But apart from a few meetings with Putin at his favorite and now famous stable, Macron didn't really achieve much. However, what stood out then was his commitment to play a visible and decisive role in European politics despite transatlantic dependence. It was the same ambition during his latest trip to China that made Macron overstep Europe's transatlantic solidarity and demand an equal footing as US President Biden in search for a solution to Ukraine. Macron also hoped that Xi will show at least some concern about the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus. However, their joint declaration did not say anything about Russia's actions in Ukraine. The French president's visit could not help his ambitions for France to emerge as an arbiter of a watershed global conflict. Perhaps he was erroneously counting on Xi's commitment to the so-called 12-point peace plan for Ukraine. So those were the reasons why Macron went to China. Now, what is so discordant about France's quest for strategic autonomy? France's tryst with strategic autonomy has its roots in Second World War experiences that sidelined France and the rest of Europe as well and made it dependent on the United States. So what strategic autonomy means for France and through it for Europe is regaining its lost ability to make decisions for itself in the global order. While prima facie a correct aspiration, it has often fallen short because of the very way in which Europe's post-war security has been outsourced to the US and the bloc has been single-mindedly immersed in the pursuit of the world's most successful interstate economic integration experiment, the European Union. As Macron came to power in 2017, it became a stated foreign policy goal. Just like how pension reforms became a stated domestic policy goal, but that's another discussion for another day. So it became a foreign policy goal for France to pursue a more independent policy and not one that is mere footnote to the dominant transatlantic dynamic. But all this was before the war. Macron was not only actively pursuing a solution to the crisis in eastern Ukraine under the Normandy format talks, and I have written a long piece on it. His stewardship of the Council of the EU in 2022 also ushered in a new era for Europe to be more independent in its security under the unprecedented document titled Strategic Compass. In 2019, as the bloc readied for Brexit and later when Angela Merkel stepped down in 2021, a young Macron saw strategic autonomy as the real emancipatory project for the EU to gain what it had lost to a brain-dead NATO. Hope you remember that infamous comment made by Macron. But then came the unthinkable, the war in Ukraine that, among other things, proved that transatlantic security guarantees under NATO and the US remain the cornerstone of EU's very existence. It also made Europe realize that there is little dispute on its transatlantic dependence and that it should double down on its efforts to achieve capabilities and strategic autonomy that will allow it to stand by itself. In my previous piece, I have described how the new security architecture is emerging in Europe. You might like to take a look at it. So, why the hue and cry? It is because even though the sentiment was right, the timing was awful. Just as Brussels has left no stone unturned to uphold the show of solidarity and unity of support for Ukraine, Macron, a formidable player and architect of EU's post-Merkel worldview, seemed to debunk that idea of united transatlantic bloc and went solo in stating that France has an independent foreign policy from the US. And here comes the catch. Recent French defense policy documents are undoubtedly anything but pro-China. For instance, April 2023 draft military law speaks of China threatening to destabilize the Indo-Pacific while reiterating concern for the security of France's territories in the region. This law and almost every other French national security document or statement of military policy emphasizes deepening ties with NATO and the criticality of France's strategic cooperation with the US. France's damaging proclamations also came at a terrible time. Europe was debating the impact of the US intelligence leaks on the West's support to Ukraine and the damage to transatlantic ties from America spying on its allies. It was also a sensitive time because Washington, D.C. and Brussels were busy ironing out any unevenness due to those leaks in time before Ukraine's upcoming counteroffensive begins. And lo and behold, there came Macron's solo act. So here comes the question. Didn't the French president know that he was throwing down the gauntlet? Actually, Europe is tired of being pushed around by external powers, notably because of its complicated three-pronged relationship with the US, Russia, and China, which became vulnerable with the fast-changing dynamics between the three. Amid all the flux, China remains the EU's highest trading partner, even when listed as a systemic rival. Now, looking at it from the constructivist lens, just as anarchy is what you make of it, autonomy is also what one makes of it. The agency here, European Union, is entitled to the meaning it wishes to ascribe to that concept as long as it achieves larger foreign policy objectives. Now, Europe knows that France alone doesn't speak for the continent. That diversity of views within the EU is a healthy sign of a thinking, contemplating society. No matter how wrong the timing, Macron's views do not and will not change his policies either towards the Indo-Pacific or towards Taiwan, and least of all towards Ukraine. For India, then, there is an unmissable silver lining amid all noise of a free-thinking France. France has been India's preeminent strategic partner. France-India ties have sustained despite all geopolitical hiccups, including sanctions on India after our nuclear tests. Further, France is also a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. True to middle power congruence, New Delhi must embark upon exploring the potential of unwavering French support to India at the UNSC. The pursuit of freedom and a truly French mark in world affairs by Paris could turn in New Delhi's favour. When diversification is the mantra, why shouldn't New Delhi diversify its support base at the UNSC? I'll be back to discuss that and more geopolitical issues of pressing concern. Stay tuned.